Hello guys, it's so nice to see you again. I took a little break since I was recovering from nose surgery, but I'm all better now and I'm ready to hop back into this. So let's just jump right back in. We are back in New York City today with another case, well, another failure from the ACS. So let's just hop back into it. Elisa Izquierdo was born on February 11th of 1989 in Brooklyn, New York, to parents Gustavo Izquierdo and Awilda Lopez. Gustavo had immigrated to the United States from Cuba and had big dreams of being a dance teacher. Elisa's mother was a Brooklyn native of Puerto Rican descent. Her parents met at the Fort Greene homeless shelter in 1987. Gustavo was the cleaner and caterer at the homeless shelter, and Awilda became a resident after her and her boyfriend had been evicted from their apartment due to the inability to pay rent. At the time, Awilda already had 2 children with that boyfriend. Soon after, Gustavo, Elisa's dad, and Awilda began dating during her stay at the shelter, but that was soon ended by Gustavo because he had found out that Awilda, and this is at the time that she was pregnant, had began using crack cocaine. Awilda was spiraling so bad that her own family had to tell her about herself, which resulted in her losing her 2 kids. Baby Elisa was born addicted to crack cocaine, so immediately after her birth, ACS was notified and she was removed from the home. And ACS stands for Administration of Child Services, for those of you who don't know. So full custody was granted to Gustavo, who was a first-time dad. This was his first child, but he took on the role happily. He was so excited to have a child and to fill the fatherly role. So he doted on her so much. He even took parenting classes before her birth and then after she was born, so he can keep up to date with items that he needed to learn about to make sure that he remained prepared. Which I do think all parents should take parenting classes, or if you're thinking about having kids, I think it is helpful to see what the current trends are and to just get a little bit more background information. There's lots of things people don't think about when it comes to babies, but back to the story. So Gustavo also asked his family for parenting tips and tricks as well, and he would throw Elisa these elaborate parties for any occasion, whether it was a birthday, a baptism, any event. He would go all out for his little girl. For her baptism, he rented out an entire banquet hall. Family and friends joined. Everyone had a great time. They would say later on that Elisa was his whole life. He would always call her his little princess. That was his girl. He would do anything for her. Family members also said that he used to dress Elisa up as a doll. I thought that was super cute. In 1990, Gustavo enrolled Elisa in the Brooklyn TWCA Montessori Day School. Shortly after, though, he began to fall ill, and his illness made it really difficult for him to pay for Elisa's schooling since he was in and out of hospital so much. It was taking away from his working time. But thankfully, since Elisa was such a bright and shining star, the teachers at her school, as well as the principal, introduced her to one of the school's patrons, which is Prince Michael of Greece and Monaco. In 1993, when the prince came to the school to do a visit, Elisa leapt into his arms and stayed by his side for the remainder of his trip. And he really took a liking to her. So in turn, he offered to pay for her private tuition up until she graduated 12th grade. So he was going to fund her tuition at the Brooklyn Friends School until graduation. I thought that was amazing. Elisa was so thankful that they would communicate, and she would send handwritten notes and pictures to Prince Michael and expressing her gratitude, and he would also send her some notes back. He would also send her some notes and small gifts back. Unfortunately, things start to take a turn where that same year, Elisa was enrolled in preschool. Awilda, her mother, had beaten her addiction, which sounds great, but because of the events in this, we know that that isn't the case. She had beaten her addiction by attending rehab. She'd gotten married, she was pregnant at the time, and she had secured stable living conditions. So what does all this mean? That she now is up for the running to get little Elisa back. A social worker signed an affidavit that Awilda was doing better, and later on in December of 1990, she gave birth to another daughter named Taisha. She also regained custody of her two oldest children who came before Elisa. In November of 1991, Awilda secured unsupervised visitation rights to Elisa. This awarded her custody of Elisa every other weekend. And unfortunately, that is when the abuse began. Word got out due to Elisa's two older siblings letting the rest of the family know that during these visits, Elisa was being severely abused by her mother and stepfather. She was also being neglected. They were not taking care of her effectively. These adults that the kids told did nothing to, they didn't inform the authorities. They didn't go up to check on Elisa. It fell upon deaf ears. Elisa had told her dad and her teachers about what was going on in these unsupervised visits with her mother and how she was being hit in the head and locked in a closet. She told her father that she never wanted to see her mother again, and Gustavo noted that Elisa had begun wetting the bed in addition to losing control of her bowels. So not only was she, peeing at night, she wasn't able to control when she would go to the bathroom, whether it was number 1 or number 2, which is a sign of abuse. Little Elisa would also get really bad nightmares when she had to learn that she was going to her mother's house soon. She wasn't able to sleep. She would wake up screaming. It wasn't a good time for her. Alicia Stoltz, a family friend of Gustavo, also noticed that Elisa would always vomit when she came back from visiting her mom, and she refused to enter bathrooms. Both Gustavo and Elisa's teachers told the authorities about the abuse, so at least somebody was reporting. Elisa herself also told the social worker about the mistreatment and abuse. So just for tallying up's sake, that's Elisa, her parents, the school, and the Elisa and Alicia, I know the names sound pretty similar. Multiple people are coming forward to let them know that this child is being abused and nobody's doing anything about it. In 1992, her father applied to have Awilda's visitation rights seized, but for whatever reason, the courts ruled that visitation rights could continue just under the conditions that Awilda must not strike or otherwise harm her daughter, which what is a piece of paper going to do to stop that, truly? No one was there to enforce this, and it went on for another year. And in 1993, Gustavo began making plans to get his sweet, lovely daughter away from her psychotic mom and take her back to Cuba, where they would relocate. He bought plane tickets, and they were set to fly back on May 26, 1994. However, remember the illness that I stated earlier that Gustavo had, it came back and it was horrific. He had admitted himself into the hospital with complaints of bad lungs, which was later determined to be lung cancer. Gustavo Izquierdo was never able to get cured of his lung cancer and died on May 26th, the same date that he planned to travel to Cuba with Elisa, so she never made it. Shortly after that, whenever Elisa would ask her mom where her father was, she would just scream out to her, "Your father's dead." After hearing the news of Gustavo's death, the director of Elisa's school, Phyllis Bryce, contacted a family court judge to express her dire concerns of both herself and members of the staff as to who would get custody over Elisa. They did not want her mother to have her because they knew what happened. Awilda applied for full permanent custody of Elisa and was initially granted temporary custody of her. Elsa Canizares, which I know this name is also very similar to Elisa, but this is a different individual. This is Gustavo's cousin. She challenged to get this ruling annulled, and she also applied for custody of Elisa, stating the documented abuse that she had previously endured while she was with her mother during these unsupervised visits. She also used examples of the way that Awilda would speak to Elisa as kind of more backing to her claim to wanting to take care of her. Both the head teacher of the school Elisa still attended and Prince Michael of Greece also wrote personal letters to Judge Phoebe Greenbaum opposing the initial temporary custody that was granted to Awilda. They provided their full support for Elsa Canizares' application to obtain permanent legal custody of Lisa. And in his letter to Judge Greenbaum, Prince Michael emphasized his intentions to pay for Elisa's full education at Brooklyn Friends School should Elisa Canizares be awarded custody of the child. Typically, that'd be enough to show that she would be getting top-notch education and would be safe from harm, but for whatever reason, they still granted Awilda custody of Elisa. Elsa had no money for legal fees to properly fight for custody of her. However, I don't know how Awilda's always able to work the system, but she was able to obtain an attorney from the Legal Aid Society and a federally funded parenting program. According to Elisa, at the hearing, the legal representative for Awilda testified as to her valiant efforts to refrain from relapsing into drug use, falsely claiming that caseworkers had visited the Lopez residence and that Elisa had expressed a strong desire to live with her biological mother, which we know is untrue. She might have stopped using drugs for a little while, but I don't believe that Elisa would ever want to live with her mother. Furthermore, Elisa was criticized by Awilda's attorney at the hearing for having the nerve to try and take Elisa away from her biological mother. And as a rebuttal, Elisa stated that her nerve came from a fear of Elisa being placed with her psychopathic mother. She didn't say those words, but I added those in. Awilda's application to obtain permanent custody of Elisa was later approved by Judge Greenbaum in September 1994, and just one short year later, Elisa would be dead. The first thing Awilda did after getting full custody of Elisa was to take her out of the school that her father put her into, the private school, and enrolled her into PS 126, which is a public school 126 in New York, where teachers and staff quickly noticed how withdrawn, emotionally disturbed, and uncommunicative Elisa was. She also peed very frequently, and they noted that she came to school with bruises very frequently, and she had begun ripping out sections of her hair. She was so traumatized, and she didn't even have the love of her father to balance this out anymore. She was entirely left alone in this world. On March 14th, 1995, an anonymous letter was posted to the Manhattan Child Welfare Authorities, and in this letter it stated that Awilda had cut off a lot of Elisa's hair and had begun locking her into a dark room for extensive periods of time. 6 days later, Elisa was admitted into the hospital with a fractured shoulder that was left untreated for 3 whole days. All of the talk around school at PS 126 regarding the evident abuse were also reported to the Manhattan Child Welfare Authorities, since, school teachers are mandated reporters. The Child Welfare Authority soon replied to the school's concerns and said that they were not reportable due to the lack of direct evidence of child abuse or neglect. And because of that, this report was rejected, which I don't really understand how they don't have proof. Did they not go out and see the state of her? Because she was constantly wobbling around, unable to hold her bowels. You could take one look at Elisa and notice that she was not in a good state. So I don't understand where they came to that decision by. A further factor in the decision was the fact that Elisa had been under court-ordered caseworker supervision in response to the school having having reported the abuse of her daughter to the child welfare authorities and a subsequent home visit by the school, Awilda, who was back on the crack by now, withdrew Elisa from school from PS 126 in December of 1994. And when she withdrew her out of here, she did not enroll her in any other school. She was done getting an education at this. Despite the fact that in addition to having, by this time, 6 children, Awilda has 6 children, 3 of whom had been born after Elisa. Awilda mostly targeted Elisa for all of this abuse. The other kids would get abused a bit, but never to the extent that Elisa got abused. Elisa was locked into her bedroom. She was denied any opportunity to speak with her own siblings or to leave the apartment, and she was denied access to using the toilet, which is odd because she already can't control her bowels, and I think this is kind of the abuse that led to this anyways. Moving on, she was forced to use a chamber pot, which, okay, I'm gonna go on another tangent now. This is also like reminding me of the case that I did previously on Zymir Perkins and how his mother would make him use a bucket as well. I don't get this part of the abuse. Like, wouldn't that just make more work for you? You have to clean it and you have to smell it, but I digress. Neighbors also reported hearing sounds of Elisa being beaten and otherwise abused. And they later reported hearing Elisa pleading with her mother to stop hitting her and crying out, saying, "Mommy, mommy, please stop, no more. I'm sorry," which she has nothing to apologize for, but I can only imagine how scared she was. Some neighbors did report the suspicion of child abuse to child welfare services, but others knew of the abuse that Elisa and her siblings were going through and did nothing to report it to any authorities at all. Some neighbors noted that Awilda would refer to Elisa as a mongoloid and a filthy little whore who had been placed under a spell by her father. Disgusting. A representative from the federally funded parenting program, which had endorsed Awilda's initial motion to achieve sole custody of her daughter, also reported that Awilda had herself phoned her complaining that Elisa was unable to control her bladder or bowels and had cut off her own hair and was apparently drinking out of the toilet, which I don't know if that's true or if she was depriving her of food and water, so that was the only source of water. But I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that she's lying. She did not do any of these things to herself. In response to this phone call from Awilda, the representative did call the child welfare authorities, who rebuffed his claims to visit the household. That's literally their whole job, is to visit the household. If you get a case of someone calling in saying they need help, that's literally your job, to go and help. Lieutenant Luis Gonzalez was quoted as saying that in his 22 years of service with the NYPD, this is the worst case of child abuse that he had ever seen. And he said this as he was recollecting the extensive physical, mental, emotional, and sexual abuse suffered by Elisa Izquierdo. Awilda would repeatedly punch, kick, and force Elisa to eat her own feces and drink ammoniated water. Awilda would also mop the floor with Elisa's head and face and inflict burns on her head, face, lips, and body. She'd also, this part gets a little graphic. This whole case is graphic, but Elisa's mother would sodomize her with a hairbrush or toothbrush. She would hang her by the shower rod just for fun, entertainment, and then she would also drop a chest of drawers onto her fingers and toes. She was just an evil woman. Awilda's husband, Carlos Lopez, who was also a crackhead, is known to have repeatedly physically abused and neglected Elisa and her other 2 older siblings, the ones that weren't his. And on November 15th, Carlos was arrested for a parole violation. 7 days later, on the evening of November 22nd, Awilda called one of her sisters, Mercy Torres, to tell her that Elisa was like Arsler. I'm not going to say that word. I don't think I'm allowed to. Like Arsler on the bed with fluid, which was later determined to be brain fluid, leaking from her nose and mouth. In addition, Awilda told her sister that Elisa would not eat or drink. When Mercy insisted that she take Elisa to the hospital, Awilda said she would think about it after she had finished cleaning the dishes, which is also something that Zymir's mom did too. She didn't take him to the ER until after she had did her makeup and did her hair and took her time. I don't know. The following morning, she spent the night. The next morning, Awilda contacted a neighbor who she asked to come over and take a look at Elisa's lifeless body. The neighbor was unable to find any signs of life, so she urged Awilda to call the police, and when Awilda refused to call the police, the neighbor did so immediately, which is great. I'm glad that that neighbor had some sense about them and did something. While the ambulance was on the way, Awilda began claiming she was going to commit suicide. She is still here to this day, so she did not. Awilda had initially confessed to having thrown Elisa's head first into a concrete wall 2 days prior to her contacting the neighbor, adding that Elisa had neither talked nor walked after this. And afterwards, the autopsy revealed that Elisa had several injuries, including broken fingers, one bone which was protruding through her skin, a broken toe, damage to her internal organs, and deep welts and burns across her face and body and head. In addition, her private parts also did have signs of trauma, including tearing, and 30 circular marks were found on her body, and these were impressions left from the stone on a ring from whoever, either Carlos or Awilda, after they had struck her multiple times. So these injuries were proven to be, after being forensically tested, were shown that this happened over a long period of time. Elisa Izquierdo's funeral was held on November 29th, 1995. The service was officiated by Reverend Agostinelli, I hope I pronounced that right, who informed the over 300 mourners in attendance that Elisa had been murdered not only by her own mother, but by the silence of many, by the neglect of child welfare institutions, and the moral mediocrity that has intoxicated our neighbors, which I agree with to an extent. I think multiple people did speak up. It's just, I'm going to put the onus on the mother and the child welfare agencies and authorities because it was their job to remove her from the home. Prior to Lisa's burial, a wake was held. In attendance was neighbors, politicians, Prince Michael of Greece came down, and members of the public. Elisa's casket remained open throughout the ceremony, and the extensive damage that was inflicted to her face and neck were heavily concealed by makeup. Elisa wore a crown of white flowers on her head. A single rose was placed in her hand, and her coffin had white flowers surrounding her. A Barbie doll was given to Elisa by her father, which she's known to have loved. It was her favorite doll ever, and it was placed alongside her body in the casket. Many mourners placed additional flowers, toys, and stuffed animals, as well as notes of sympathy in and around her coffin prior to her casket being closed and her burial at Cypress Hills Cemetery. Elisa's gravestone inscription reads, "World, please watch over the children." On June 25th, 1996, Awilda Lopez pleaded guilty to the second-degree murder of her daughter at the New York State Supreme Court. Awilda pleaded guilty to the deal offered by the prosecution team with the knowledge that she would be eligible for parole after serving 15 years which I don't believe she should have even gotten any type of parole. She should have been given life and that's it. Like, or at least, life. The following month, Judge Schlesinger sentenced Obelda Lopez to a term of 15 years to life. Prior to formal sentencing, Judge Schlesinger openly criticized the child welfare system within New York, stating, "We have not created procedures to do everything necessary to protect the young and vulnerable in this society. The system has failed to protect our babies, and don't tell me how much it costs. If anything good comes from this horrendous tragedy, it will be that we give priority to these babies," which is absolutely correct. The child welfare system, this was a very missed opportunity to do good and to save a child, and they fumbled greatly. On October 29th, 1996, Elisa's stepfather, Carlos, was sentenced to serve between 1.5 and 3 years in prison. And this is set to run consecutively with the sentence he was serving at the time of Elisa's death. This sentence was in relation to one specific instance of physical abuse, which was on October 31st, Halloween Day of 1995, in which he had repeatedly banged Elisa's head against a concrete wall in the presence of her siblings. Which, let's talk about the trauma these siblings probably have from watching this child be abused, their sibling be abused so greatly. Carlos pleaded guilty to this charge of attempted second-degree assault, but claimed that he actually did not assault Elisa, which is a lie. Allegedly. Well, not allegedly. He was found guilty. But he had opted to plead guilty to spare his children the emotional trauma of having to testify against him, which he didn't spare them any of the emotional trauma from seeing him abuse this poor young girl. Judge Schlesinger rejected this claim outright, and I'm going to give my snaps to Judge Schlesinger. They did their big one with this one. He really let him have it. The public outrage at Elisa's death was fueled by revelations that despite Obelda Lopez's evident and spiraling drug addiction and the obvious increased signs of the ongoing abuse to Elisa at the hands of her mother and stepfather, she not only had been awarded custody in 1994 in spite of the protests from the family and school staff and the prince, but numerous concerns of Elisa's safety were reported to child welfare agencies after all of this had happened, after she was placed into her care, and they had failed to remove her from the house. Following Elisa's death and subsequent public funeral, her life story became the subject of multiple local and national media articles. From local tabloids such as the New York Daily News and the New York Post, to her story being given front page coverage in the 1995 edition of Time magazine under the title A Shameful Death. Elisa's story was also featured in August 1996 episode of Dateline NBC. A lot of the media coverage around this case was openly scathing to the New York child welfare agencies, as they should be, as well as Judge Phoebe Greenbaum, who was the one who awarded Elisa's mom with custody of her in the first place. Following Elisa's death, Judge Greenbaum was subjected to severe criticism of her decision, and she responded to this criticism by claiming that she had been merely following procedural recommendations when she had made her custodial decision. Following procedural recommendations. What procedure, if you see a kid getting abused, you hear from people who know her in real life what's going on, as well as the child herself, you take no account into what the child's saying. You just go with whatever you feel like, because it's procedure. What? And I get that courts favor the mothers, you want to keep them in, but Obelda was categorically a terrible mother. So there was no saving her. Then Mayor Rudy Giuliani would state to the media that judges ultimately make the decision based on all the facts and records, and they're supposed to go behind these things and to make the determinations. And he's correct. That was her main job, was to make a decision, and she didn't. She made a decision actually, but it was the wrong one. Mayor Giuliani instigated an urgent review of the city's child welfare system. This review inspired the creation of the Administration for Child Services, which is an agency solely devoted to the issues of child welfare in New York. As we now know, ACS has not lived up to what it was supposed to be, but at the time, this was like the perfect thing. We thought it would be super helpful, and it was for a time until the same issues began to arise. On February 12, 1996, Governor George Pataki formally signed Elisa's law into legislation. This legislation was signed into law in front of several of Elisa's relatives. Elisa's law is designed to balance the need for increased accountability through public awareness and government oversight with the privacy interests of individuals involved in children protective services cases, particularly in regards to the death of children as suffering from any form of neglect or abuse. All reports pertaining to the death of children resulting from child abuse, they do not, however, give the actual names of the deceased children for privacy reasons, as well as the actual caseworkers assigned to investigate the reports of suspected child abuse or neglect. However, these reports do list each and every complaint and or report submitted related to the child or children and the agency's actual response. In addition, these public records contain an assessment detailing whether or not the agency's overall response had been adequate. Elisa's law continues to take hold on the child welfare agencies of New York City and the Administration for Child Services. It makes them publicly accountable for their actions, and I think that's a beautiful thing. Elisa's 5 siblings were raised in separate foster homes. Elisa's siblings suffered from extreme emotional and mental trauma due to witnessing the abuse, the physical, mental, sexual abuse that was inflicted on their sister. Awilda Lopez initially became eligible for parole in 2010. She was denied parole in 2022, but was released from the medium security Taconic Correctional Facility on April 19th, 2022. She served 26 years in prison, which was definitely not enough. She deserved to spend 100 years in prison for what she did to her. Now, what are my thoughts? One, I think that Judge Greenbaum should be disbarred, if not already, or she should have been disbarred. And all of her previous cases need to be looked in as well, because if she could fumble so greatly on this scale, what was she able to do in other cases? Like, her character should be up for question. Her law license should be up for question, and she should not be able to practice law anymore just off the strength of this one case. This was a severe miscarriage of justice. I'm going to shift to Awilda. Awilda needs medication, and by medication I mean a big dose of lethal injection. She should not be able to live. Since her child had to die because of her, she should also die. I stand by that. I don't know what caused this, if it was all the crack she was consuming, if that messed up something in her head, but to me it seemed like she always had unstable tendencies prior to what happened. So I'm just going to chalk it up to her not being a fit parent. Her husband Carlos should have gotten more time. He should have gotten like 15 years minimum, honestly. Like, he was not the main aggressor, but the things he did just off of the strength of him bashing her head into the concrete wall, that should give you 15 years. And everyone in the yard should know what he did to that little girl. And I'm sure he wouldn't like what they do to him after that. Ultimately, I think that Awilda was jealous of her daughter. She was jealous that her father, who left her, loved her so much. Well, let me rephrase that. Her father, who left Awilda, loved Elisa so much. She was getting taken care of. She was doted on. She had this great opportunity at education and the chance to be free of her mother, and she couldn't stand it. I know it drove her crazy thinking about it. She even had the support of a prince. Like, her daughter was living the Cinderella dream, and she did everything in her power to knock her down a peg and to make her seem as little as Awilda was. And the world is paying for it. There's no telling how great Elisa would have been, what she would have done for the world, what she would have done for her community. And for that, it will always be an injustice. It's ultimately, her death did move legislation, but at what cost? She should still be here. And yeah, 1989, how old would she be? Elisa would be 35 now if she was alive. She might be married, she might have her own kids, she might be teaching, might be an astronaut. We will never know because of the actions of her mother. And the fact that Elisa's mom, Awilda, is just out here. I don't even like calling her mother. The fact that Awilda is even out here on the streets free after what she did, insanity. So if you have kids, hug them tight, treat them right. And if you know you're not a fit parent, don't fight for custody of your kid. Give them a fighting chance to be something and be better than you are. That's all I have to say. Thank you for joining me and hearing about Elisa's case. She was a beautiful little girl, and she will be missed. And rest in peace to her father, Gustavo. He was a true light who really loved his daughter, and it's a shame that he wasn't able to stick around longer to be there for her. All right, thank you. Bye.